very much. We are a group of storytellers here, so I'll also begin with a story. When I was launching my book in the US, A Human Being Died That Night, one of the places I did it was in LA at a library, the Library of LA. And it's a large library, it's like auditorium style, it sits about 450 people, and it was packed. At the end of the conversation with the chair, the moderator said, "That's it now, no more questions." But there was a woman in the audience who was very eager, really anxious to ask a question. So I sort of asked the moderator to allow her to speak. So she got up, and immediately, her first words, she broke down. She says, "I read the book last night. I couldn't put it down. I couldn't sleep. I cried all night," and then she started crying. And she went on, "I'm a South African, I'm an Afrikaner. I feel so ashamed about my history, having benefited from apartheid." It's a young woman, and I'm here in LA to study my master's. I wanted to escape, but now being confronted with this story, I feel so much heaviness. And she's sobbing by now, really like sobbing in between words. And so she ends by saying, "I want to ask for forgiveness." So here I am, this South African black woman on stage, and hall full of white Americans, mostly white Americans. It's in LA. And she sobs heavily, and she says, "I ask you for forgiveness." And so I walk towards the end of the stage, and I extend my arm, and she walks towards me, and we embrace. The applaud in the room, you could have heard a pin drop. And I thought about it afterwards. I thought about what was this about? Not only the reaching out and us reaching out to each other, but what's the feeling in the room about? And it occurred to me that what's happening on stage between me and this woman, her name is Susan, is something that is conveyed in public, and every one of the people sitting in the audience has a story to tell about their own pain, whatever their pain is. And so the white Americans of all generations sitting in the room, the moment evokes something in them as whites in America who have not confronted their own story and their own past. And one of the things that Susan says, and this is the most important part of my story, at the end of her sobbing, she says, "I want to go back home. Now I want to go back home and give back home what I failed to do when I benefited from apartheid." Now, there's skepticism, of course, people come, Americans, colleagues say, what's that, this melodramatic, South African, Afrikaner, what's all this, and then they kind of dismiss it. But I felt that it was not flippant. I felt that it was not an act. I felt that there was something genuine about it. I'm going to say something about this and move on to the story of the question today, but I want to say something about Susan. Months later, or even a year later, at the time we had a newspaper here called This Day. I was asked to write pieces every month for This Day. So I shared this story. It was Reconciliation Day. I shared this story and its significance for other parts, other countries in the world that are grappling with these issues of a terrible past that has not been confronted and dealt with. A few days later, I received an email from Susan. Susan happens to be in Pietermaritzburg. She's learning Zulu. She's preparing to go to a community in KwaZulu-Natal to work with a group of HIV AIDS projects, people who were counseling and providing support and all sorts of other, you know, community building projects. And she is in Pietermaritzburg learning, doing what she said she was going to do when she was sobbing in that room. And so forgiveness and these processes of forgiveness, they can be flippant, but sometimes they can be profound. They can be about changing, transforming consciousness. And at the end of the day, these processes are really about the question, how do we transform consciousness? So these processes of forgiveness, it seems to me, really go beyond forgiveness. And this is why I am beginning to think about this word as the wrong word. That forgiveness is the wrong word. It doesn't describe what is going on. We're talking about the complexity, just holding the complexity and allowing the complexity to unfold. So forgiveness sounds like, you know, a word that concludes something. You know, it's the end, it's a chapter, it's the closure, you move on. In fact, often people speak about forgive and forget. On the contrary, I think forgiveness is actually the beginning. It's an opening up rather than a closing and a moving on. It's an opening up. It's an opening up of the space of engagement. It's that first step of, I can actually connect with you now that I've heard your pain and you've heard mine, and you are thinking about what you did to me. It opens the space for us to engage. And that's always the challenging part. That's the most challenging part, is that beginning of trusting that I can stand in front of Wilhelm, despite the fact that his father is a Verwoerd, grandfather is a Verwoerd, and his father is a Verwoerd. I can stand and trust that if I open myself up, and he does too, something is going to emerge. I call forgiveness now in my new writing the emergence of the unexpected. Because once we encounter one another, opening ourselves up to the possibility of moral imagination, then that is what springs out of that openness. We never knew that we were going to have actual stories of forgiveness at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We knew that this is a commission of reconciliation. It's created so that people can think about the possibility of reconciling. It's not true that people are told to forgive, by the way. That's another story. Now, we didn't expect that there would be actually, and when these stories emerged, we were intrigued. We were intrigued in part because the canons of this kind of work have told us that it's impossible. The experts have told us that it can't happen. There are major canonical texts on this that have kind of, you know, continued to be the truth, that this can't happen. And yet here was a moment in our country where we got together like we are sitting now, and something happens on stage. And the woman whose husband was killed turned to the killer and says, I forgive you. And sometimes it doesn't end there. They even go as far as to say, I wish you well. And this is the thing about forgiveness, that it's a kind of compassion and caring that is about, that goes beyond the words themselves. That is about, I care for you so much that I want to begin this journey with you and make sure that actually you stay this way. And this is why forgiveness, the word forgiving perhaps is better than forgiveness, because it's almost like it's a process, and sometimes it's not a straight line. You know, people whom I've worked with, I have interviewed, they say, there are days I wake up, especially around anniversaries, I'm angry, you know, I'm filled with resentment because this would have been my son or my husband's, birthday, or we would have been celebrating with my husband our anniversary, or now it's Christmas and he's not gonna be sitting around. So there are days when I feel angry and I feel resentful, but what restores me is the memory of that moment, of that person recognizing my pain. It sounds like something very little. People say, oh, forgiveness, it's symbolic and so on. Symbols are very important when people are hurt. And so when people who are forgiven say, what restores me is a return to that relational moment when this person looked in my eyes and said, I recognize the pain that I caused you. It's not going to bring the loved one back, but what it does, and this is huge, it recognizes that the perpetrator did something terrible to another human being. Remember that when these people commit their atrocities, they dehumanize the other. You are a non-human being. You do not exist as a human. You do not bleed the same way. You do not experience the pain the same way. And so this enables them to commit their atrocities. They dehumanize the other. But what is also more important, perhaps, to realize is that before that border is crossed, because you ask the question, how can, even so, they must know that this is wrong. But before the border to commit the atrocity is crossed, they have to dehumanize the self. And I think that that damage to that person who does not acknowledge the voice of conscience is the greatest tragedy in these stories. All these people who committed atrocities and those who turned a blind eye when they saw that there are atrocities being committed. There's a wounding in them. It's a dehumanization of the self. And so it means that this work of forgiveness, the word, again, it's the wrong word, but this, for want of a better word, and because it is a working word, this word captures really healing on multiple levels of healing, because you're healing the person who for many years no one ever said, I recognize that I've pained, I've caused you pain. And so that moment of rehumanizing you as the survivor and rehumanizing your lost loved ones, because those words also capture something about the humanity, the recognition of the humanity of the other. Our problems are problems of an absence of recognition. When I'm treated in the way that you described, I'm excluded from opportunities, as a result, now I'm looking back, there are so many lost moments, lost time because of exclusion. That is because I am not recognized as a fellow human being in my country. You were in exile. I was in South Africa, but I could never say I am a South African. I was only able to do that when I flew back after having voted in the United States and coming back home and feeling I am a South African. And so the pain, the pain is very profound, and so the act of recognition is very important. And again, on the question of, the word being wrong, when we were at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, white people were, we had a problem. White people didn't want to come. Those who came, they came and said like this, we're going to see what these people are going to say. And you could see the transformation in some of them, really. I mean, this is why we are in this work, because we know it works in the sense of transforming the consciousness of people. When people actually understand the pain that has happened to the other, it opens them up and they are able to see what they refused to not that they didn't see, but they were speaking from a comfort zone. what you see then during the hearings of the commission, you would see the person actually, you know, the body language would change. And sometimes people would start crying, you know, and so, some people might say, oh, it's crocodile tears, but it's emotion. It's a show of emotion. The challenge is, how do you sustain that emotion so that it's taken to another level? Now, other people, some people, you know, these people cried and other people didn't want to cry. Why? Even though they felt the emotion, but they dare not allow themselves to cry. Why? Because shame is too great. That's the other side of forgiveness or remorse. I think that this other word, remorse, is a very important word. We often talk, even in the scholarship actually, forgiveness is often debated and discussed as a word that, or as a process that happens on its own. So those who don't want to show, even though they feel the shame, they dare not embrace that shame because it makes them feel evil. That's part of the problem, to add to what we were saying earlier, Willem, that it's the fear of facing the shame. Because shame means that I am admitting that there's an evil part in what I did or did not do. So people deny the shame, and once people deny the shame, they are unable to connect to the pain of the other because they are so focused on themselves. I feel shame, I can't admit, I have to wiggle myself out of this, and they make stories and this and the other, you know, I wasn't there, or I actually didn't support apartheid, actually I never even voted, you know, and all of this kind of thing. And it's a fear, you know, it's a fear people, it's a self-protective measure. Deny the shame and deny the guilt. And yet the healing begins actually with opening up to even that shame. But here is a challenging thing for people now who are on the other side, who are the oppressed people. It's challenging, but that is, you know, we've found that this is a reality, that the openness, unfortunately, demands, in order for us to have conversations that are healing, it is necessary that for both sides, you know, the anger is important, and we ought to express the anger. And so if there is a relationship that is developing from a place of trust of the process, trust for the process, even if there is the anger, the person who did the deed or who supported the deed or did not speak out against the deed, if they're open enough, they accept and acknowledge and understand where the anger comes from, instead of saying, why are you angry at me? You know, we're supposed to be reconciled, why are you now angry? But the other side of the story is that then having the anger having played its part and having, you know, kind of played out, there is a moment then of reflection on what the other person, where the other person is emotionally. And if that openness is present, then the connection and the change and transformation often unfolds. And hence this notion of the emergence of the unexpected. But all of that requires that we take the risk. It's a risk to let go, you know, of some of the intense emotions that we have. It's a risk, but you trust beyond the risk, you trust. And the trust is also about the fact that you trust that it's not going to happen again. The devastating thing about these acts of dunadering, you know, forgiving and coming together, is when things repeatedly happen. And the words then ought to be a promise that henceforth my consciousness is so transformed that I am going to be a better person. I am going to care. I'm going to care for you. I'm going to care for your kind, and so on. And just finally, this conversation is very important because the issue of social and economic justice, we should have this conversation side by side. Some people think that we can't have the conversation about forgiving or about, you know, these processes of transforming relationships without sorting out the issue of economic justice. I think these issues, these processes should go hand in hand, because when people are not healed, when people have not had the opportunity for someone to say, we actually did something wrong, then it becomes a traumatic burden that is not worked through. We have a word in psychology that we call working through. People need to have that healing, because then it frees them to become what they were intended to become. But if this continues to be an untold story, an internal narrative that has not been worked through, it continues to be a wall that prevents the person from becoming free to engage in ways that they can, you know, if the world allows them to heal internally as well as in terms of their external environment. And so the question itself, I would say, if we're to do a yes and no, I would say we need to complicate the question so that we can consider all the nuances and the layers and layers of stuff that's going on all sides, but to keep it in the loop, to keep that question in the loop, but not to answer to that question only, but to respond to all the other issues that play around it as well. Thank you.